Good morning. My name is Maren Miller, and my senior speech is over 4 influential women that I am willing to bet has impacted every single person in this room, but you've probably never heard of before. Not that it's your fault. History is notorious for leaving some of its most important people unknown and unnamed. And although there are thousands of men who deserve just as much recognition as the women I am profiling today, by the time my fellow seniors and I leave high school, we will have learned about the same handful of men that every American teenager learns about before graduation. So, in the interest of mixing things up and giving a head start to any Jeopardy hopefuls out there, here are 4 important women that you should know about, but probably don't. This one is for all of the writers out there. Aphra Behn was the first female British author who was able to live professionally off of her own writing. Born in 1640 in a South American colony owned by England, Aphra moved to London shortly after her marriage to a German merchant. However, after arriving in London, Aphra's husband died, leaving her familyless and penniless. Now, a less traditional woman would have tried to find a way back to the colony. Aphra, however, became a spy for King Charles II during the Netherlands Wars. While in Holland, Aphra discovered that the Dutch planned on sailing to England and attacking the English fleet. However, when Aphra tried to warn Charles, he not only ignored her, but refused to pay her travel expenses, so that by the time she arrived in London, she was thrown into debtor's prison. Aphra, however, had the last laugh when from her jail cell she had an excellent view of the Dutch sailing up the Thames and burning down the English fleet. After her release from prison, Aphra began publishing novels, plays, newspaper articles, and poetry. Immediately successful, Aphra, however, was often criticized for her untraditional lifestyle because at the time, writership was an exclusively all-male profession. However, to her critics, Aphra always replied, "I had rather die in the adventure of noble achievements than live in obscure and sluggish security." Aphra, however, lived in a fiercely patriarchal society, so that when she died, instead of being buried at Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, the burial site for all of England's greatest writers, she was instead buried in a plot reserved for actresses. Now, as Americans, we love celebrating holidays dedicated to figures in our history who are important to its founding or other modes of development. However, no one has ever suggested that we celebrate Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Lady Mary was a 18th century English noblewoman who brought the smallpox vaccination to Europe. Lady Mary was infected with smallpox when she was 25. And for those of you who don't know what smallpox is, it is a viral blood disease that manifests itself on the skin of its victims. It is extremely deadly, and those who are lucky enough to survive are left with terrible scars. When Lady Mary's husband was appointed the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, however, Lady Mary discovered while in Istanbul how the Ottomans vaccinated their people against smallpox. Now, the Ottomans discovered that if you were to prick one of the skin blemishes on the skin with smallpox, you would be able to stab that needle into the skin of a healthy subject and give them a much lower concentrated form of the virus. Smallpox, much like chickenpox, is a once-in-your-lifetime disease. Once you've had it, you'll never get it again. So the idea was to give your subject a less severe case of the disease, they would hopefully successfully fight it, and they would never get it again. Now, although there was a 3% mortality rate for those inoculated with the vaccination, that was much better than the 40% mortality rate those who are not inoculated faced. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what does this have to do with American history? Well, in the years shortly before the American Revolution, there were several major smallpox outbreaks within the 13 colonies. Some of the men who were successfully inoculated with the Lady Mare method included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Furthermore, George Washington had his entire army inoculated with the Lady Mare method. And I think it goes without saying just how important George Washington's army was to the formation of the United States. Now, speaking of important creations, how many of you have ever used a computer before? All right. Well, how many of you knew that the world's first computer programmer was a 19th century British countess who was also the daughter of Lord Byron? Born in 1815, Augusta Ada Byron, Countess of Lovelace, commonly remembered as Ada Lovelace, is considered the world's first computer programmer, as well as the only legitimate daughter of the English Romantic poet Lord Byron. When Ada was 4 months old, her parents separated, and Lady Byron, eternally bitter about the separation, encouraged her daughter's interest in engineering and mathematics in order to counteract any literary pursuits she might have inherited from her father. Ada became the unofficial protege of several English mathematicians, and during her studies, Ada successfully translated an Italian manuscript on engines into English. Now, in this translation, Ada included her own footnotes, and in these footnotes was the world's first computer program, loosely defined in this case as an algorithm encoded for processing by any machine, which explains how a woman born almost a century and a half before computers were actually invented can be considered the world's first computer programmer. Once computer programming became the science that we are all very familiar with today, its early pioneers looked back at Ada's work in order to base their own work off of her very first algorithm. Now, Ada was also a bit of a visionary because during her day and age, she left writings that included her speculations that one day machines would be able to do much more than crunch numbers. And considering how I'm giving you this presentation based off of a computer slideshow, found on information I discovered on the internet, I think it's safe to say she was pretty spot on. Now, last but not least is a figure for all of the future lawyers, judges, and maybe even criminals out there. Mabel Walker Wilbrandt was America's first female public defender, as well as the Assistant Attorney General from 1921 to 1929, making her, in those 8 years, the highest-ranking woman in the American federal justice system. Now, for those of you familiar with American history, 1921 to 1929 was a very important couple of years in the American justice system. Prohibition was in full swing, and American criminals were showing an unprecedented amount of creativity in avoiding prosecution. Unfortunately for them, Mabel Walker Wilbrandt, who the newspapers affectionately referred to as the First Lady of the Law and Prohibition Portia, was in charge of the branch of the Justice Department, who were meant to prosecute all violators of the Volstead Act, or the set of American laws that banned the manufacturing and sale of alcohol. Although personally opposed to prohibition, it was still the law, and under Mabel's leadership, her department successfully won 39,072 criminal cases in 1 year. Mabel also personally argued 40 cases in front of the American Supreme Court, as well as prosecuted the world's, or at least America's, largest bootlegging ring in history. In her free time, Mabel was also a fan of prison reform and helped successfully open the first all-female federal prison in the United States. Unfortunately, despite her success as a prosecutor and successful campaigning for Herbert Hoover, Mabel was denied an appointment to Attorney General in Hoover's cabinet, a position that was not held by a woman until 1993. Now, between the writer, the nurse, the programmer, and the lawyer, I like to think that there was someone in this presentation for everyone. And I would like to use them to make one final point before I end here today. Although separately, these women made important contributions to their own fields of interest, they all share one common unifying trait that we can all relate to today. At some point of their lives, they were told no, not because they were unqualified, not because they were incapable of what they wanted to pursue, but because of something as meaningless as gender. When Aphra Behn was buried in an actress's plot, it wasn't because she was a bad writer. In fact, her career influenced all female British writers ranging from Mary Shelley to today's J.K. Rowling. It was because she dared to pursue a profession that was, at the time, completely only open to men. When Mabel Walker Wilbrandt argued those 40 cases in front of the Supreme Court, many of the judges wouldn't even look at her because they were so offended by the idea of having this woman argue in front of them. In less than 5 months, my fellow seniors and I will leave high school for the real world, a world that is more than happy to tell you that you can't do something, not because it's wrong or even against the law, but because of your background, your race, or even, as we've seen today, your gender. So if you remember nothing else, remember this. All of you have the opportunity and the chance to do whatever it is you want to do. And you should never let some silly 2-letter word be the thing that's stopping you, because it certainly didn't stop these women. Thank you.